You might think of logistics as just a military delivery service, moving boxes from point A to point B. But today, we are going to completely dismantle that idea.
Yeah, we're really going to tear that down because the sources paint a very different picture.
Right. And to set the scene for you, the listener, picture this. It's 1962. We're high in the Himalayas. The air is absolutely freezing. The terrain is treacherous. And there's this stark historical photograph from our source material that just captures this perfectly.
Oh, that photo is just, it's incredible.
It really is. It shows a group of soldiers bundled up against the cold, and they are literally hauling a massive supply truck through deep mud using sick ropes.
Right, because the engines have failed, the roads are gone, and, well, the mountains just don't care.
Exactly. They're acting as human draft animals. It's this visceral, exhausting image. And it perfectly frames the central question of our deep dive today. As operational warfare analysts, we need to answer: why does logistics ultimately decide how long and how effectively a force can actually fight?
It's a brilliant image to start with because it forces us to rethink what war actually is. I mean, we tend to focus on the flashy stuff, right?
The tactics, the generals, the firefights.
Exactly. But logistics isn't just some background support activity. It is the absolute foundation of combat power. The sources make it clear that logistics dictates three hard, unforgiving boundaries.
Which are?
Well, determines exactly where those forces can go, how long they can stay alive once they get there, and crucially, how effectively they fight.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of combat power. Because I think most people, if you ask them to measure how strong an army is, they would just say, well, count the soldiers and count the guns.
Right, which makes intuitive sense. But it's fundamentally wrong. The actual formula for combat power, as outlined in the text, is soldiers plus weapons plus supply plus mobility plus sustainment.
Wait, so it's a 5-part equation?
Yes. And here's the brutal reality of that math. If you zero out any of those last three variables...
Like if you lose your supply line.
Exactly. If you lose supply, mobility, or long-term sustainment, the first two variables, your soldiers and your weapons, effectively drop to zero.
Wow.
Yeah, a battalion of the bravest soldiers in the world simply cannot hold a mountain pass if they are starving.
Yeah.
And the most advanced artillery is, well, it's just an expensive paperweight if you don't have the fuel to move it.
Or the shells to fire it, right.
Yeah.
It's like buying a multi-million-dollar sports car but having absolutely no access to a gas station.
That's exactly the right way to look at it. The car looks incredibly dangerous, but it's not going anywhere.
So if combat power relies on that full equation, what happens to an army when the sustainment variable is compromised before the first shot is even fired?
Yeah.
Because the source text analyzes the logistic situation right before the 1962 conflict, and it looks grim.
Very grim. On paper, there is severe shortages. We're talking thousands of missing rifles, anti-tank guns, radios, transport vehicles, special winter clothing.
But it's not just a shopping list of missing items, is it?
No, and that's the mistake analysts often make. We have to look at how an equipment gap translates directly into an operational limitation, a tactical straitjacket on the battlefield.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, take the rifles. The text points out that Indian troops were still equipped with bolt-action .303 rifles.
Which is what, like pre-World War I technology?
Essentially, yes.
Huh.
Meanwhile, the opposing Chinese forces were fielding automatic weapons, heavy mortars, and machine guns.
Let me jump in here, because this is where the mechanics of combat really matter. If I have a bolt-action rifle and my opponent has an automatic weapon, I can't just use the same tactics, but, shoot a little slower.
Right. You absolutely cannot. A bolt-action rifle fundamentally changes your battlefield doctrine. Think about the physical action. You fire, and then you have to manually cycle the bolt to chamber the next round.
Which means taking your eye off the target.
Yes, you often have to break your line of sight. Your rate of fire is drastically lower. You cannot lay down heavy suppressive fire to cover your squad as they advance. When your equipment is a generation behind, your tactics are forced to be a generation behind.
So it dictates engagement distances and how you use cover.
Exactly. It's not just a missing modern gun, it's a structural limitation on how you can fight.
So the obvious question from anyone reading this is, why was there such a massive gap? Why not just buy modern rifles?
Well, that comes down to a really tricky balance between long-term national goals and immediate operational needs. The objective at the time was self-reliance in defense production.
Meaning they wanted to build it themselves.
Right. The doctrine prioritized indigenous manufacturing capability, and they kept foreign procurement buying weapons from other countries to an absolute minimum.
Which, as a national strategy, makes sense. You don't want to be reliant on foreign powers for your defense.
In a vacuum, it's a very sound strategy.
Mm.
But the execution was severely flawed. Defense manufacturing was restricted to state-owned military ordnance factories.
Wait, they didn't use civilian industry.
No, the broader civilian industry wasn't trusted or integrated into the defense production chain.
So they had this massive goal of modernizing an entire army, but they funneled all that pressure through just a handful of military factories.
That's the bottleneck, exactly. Those factories simply did not have the industrial capacity to meet the vast requirements of a modernizing force. The result was massive production delays.
So the indigenous gear wasn't ready. And because of the policy, they weren't buying foreign gear to fill the gap.
Yes, and the immediate battlefield effect was that existing units were severely under-equipped. Troops were inducted into incredibly harsh mountain environments without the fundamental tools for survival, let alone combat.
The ultimate future lesson being that preparedness cannot begin after a crisis starts. But surely military planners knew this. Didn't they have some kind of strategic reserve? The text mentions a GS reserve policy.
They did. The General Staff Reserve policy mandated holding 6 months' worth of war stocks.
Okay, but hang on. Keeping 6 months of emergency supplies only works if your factories can transition to a full war footing within those 6 months.
That's exactly.
If your domestic industry is so bottlenecked that it takes a year to spool up production, a 6-month reserve is it's like packing a weekend bag for a month-long expedition. The math guarantees starvation.
That analogy is perfect. The policy was fatally flawed because that 6-month assumption was imported. It was based entirely on British experiences from World War II.
So they took a template from a highly industrialized wartime European nation and just pasted it onto 1960s India.
Pretty much. In a fully industrialized nation with a mobilized workforce, 6 months might be plenty of time to pivot automobile factories into tank and ammunition plants. But you cannot apply a foreign historical template to a completely different industrial reality.
Reserve planning has to match your actual domestic industrial conditions.
Exactly. So limited resources led to delayed procurement, which cemented a massive capability gap.
So flawed policies created a mathematical deficit on paper. But as bad as the math was in the plains, the geography was about to multiply that deficit exponentially.
Oh, absolutely. The mountains change everything.
Here's where it gets really interesting for the listener because we have to talk about the mountain multiplier.
Right. If you want to understand mountain warfare, there is a core principle from the sources you have to commit to memory. 1 kilometer of mountain supply does not equal 1 kilometer of plain supply.
Because it's an entirely different universe of physics and human endurance. Look at that historical image we mentioned. Infrastructure in the mountains isn't just a road, it's a weapon system.
It really is. Let's map out the brutal reality of the last-mile delivery chain. Your supplies arrive at a comfortable supply base in the plains. Great. From there, trucks take them up to what's called the roadhead.
Which is the absolute furthest point a motorized vehicle can go.
Right. And as we saw in that photograph, sometimes the vehicles don't even make it that far. But assuming they do, the road ends. Now, you transfer those supplies onto animal transport, mules or ponies.
And they trek further up the mountain.
Until the terrain becomes too steep, too rocky, or the air too thin for the animals. Now, you hand those supplies off to a human porter. And that porter has to hike it up the final stretch to the forward soldier.
And like any chain, it is only as strong as its weakest link, which, in this environment, is the human being at the very end of it.
This leads to one of the most fascinating operational dilemmas in the text: the reliance on porters versus pioneers.
Break this down for me, because this blew my mind when I read it.
To move heavy loads to high-altitude outposts, the military initially relied on local civilian porters. The advantage is clear. These locals have incredible local knowledge.
And they're already acclimatized to the altitude.
Exactly. Their lungs are adapted to the thin air, they know the treacherous terrain, and they can carry significant loads.
But they are civilians.
Which is the crucial limitation.
Yeah.
You can hire them to carry boxes in peacetime, but the moment artillery starts landing and bullets are flying, they are naturally going to drop the boxes and flee.
Which makes total sense. I wouldn't stick around either. You cannot build a reliable combat supply chain on civilian labor in a free fire zone.
You can't. So the military realizes this and turns to their own guys. The pioneers. These are soldiers trained in engineering and transport. They have a uniform, they have orders, they aren't going to run away.
Problem solved, right?
Problem amplified, actually. Employing military pioneers triggered a devastating cascade known as the law of diminishing returns.
Let's walk through the physics of this because it's a brilliant, terrible mathematical trap.
Okay, imagine a pioneer standing at the base of the mountain trail. He's looking up at a forward outpost at, say, 14,000 feet. The weather is brutally cold. The round trip to walk up there, drop off supplies, and walk back down is going to take him 4 to 5 days.
Okay, so a massive trek.
Right. And because he's a human being in extreme conditions, he has to survive that journey. He needs to wear heavy winter clothing. He has to carry his own sleeping gear. And crucially, he has to carry 5 days' worth of his own rations to eat along the way.
Wait, so he is literally consuming the logistics as he carries them?
Yes. By the time that Pioneer burns through the massive amount of calories required to climb a mountain and reserves enough food to ensure he doesn't starve on the descent,
Yeah.
the effective payload, the actual amount of combat supply he can hand over to the fighting soldier at the top, was a meager 5 kilograms.
5 kilograms. That is roughly the weight of a medium-sized bag of groceries.
Yeah.
That's what he delivers after a grueling, multi-day climb in freezing weather.
It's highly inefficient. The battlefield effect of this is the systemic starvation of your front line. The lesson here is that human transport in extreme environments eventually consumes its own logistical output.
You put massive effort in at the bottom and almost nothing comes out at the top.
Exactly.
So if the ground route is literally eating its own supplies before reaching the troops, the commanders really only have one alternative. They have to look to the sky. But what happens when the sky is just as hostile as the rocks?
You find out very quickly that in mountain warfare, the climate is not just a backdrop. The weather is an active operational enemy.
The source text goes into brutal detail about this. We're talking incessant rain, freezing cold, sudden snowstorms.
And because of all the supply chain failures we just talked about, there was no forward stocking.
Meaning no pre-positioned warehouses of gear waiting for the troops.
Right, which meant those troops were bivouacking in the open. They didn't have heavy-duty tents. They didn't have proper waterproof clothing. In the high mountains, lack of shelter doesn't just mean you're uncomfortable. It leads directly to severe pulmonary ailments.
So the cold was actively depleting the combat strength of the units, sending men to the medical tent before a single shot was fired by the enemy.
Precisely.
So they are freezing, the ground supply has failed, and they are begging for air support. And this brings us to what might be the most frustrating part of the entire historical text, the airdrop case study.
Oh, it is a textbook example of a catastrophic cost-saving policy. The operational requirement was clear: remote maintenance of isolated troops via airdrops, emergency support.
But the logistic preparation was totally flawed.
To save money, the policy involved retrieving, patching up, and reusing old parachutes.
And we aren't talking about gently used parachutes carefully repacked in a pristine hangar.
Not at all. We are talking about parachutes that had been dropped onto jagged rocks, left out in the harsh snow and rain for months, eventually recovered, strapped to a mule, dragged 150 kilometers back down a mountain trail, quickly patched up by a repair team, and stuffed back into an aircraft.
The structural integrity of the fabric was completely compromised.
Completely. Which leads to an execution challenge that is entirely predictable. On average, 30 to 40% of those patched up parachutes failed to open.
Almost half.
Yes. You are loading life-saving gear rations, medicine, ammunition into an aircraft, flying through incredibly dangerous mountain weather, dropping it, and watching a third of it just smash into the rocks at terminal velocity because the fabric ripped.
And the details of what they were dropping make it even worse. The text notes a shortage of standard, portable 4-gallon jerry cans for fuel.
Right, the small containers.
So the Air Force, trying to meet the demand, resorted to dropping 44-gallon drums of kerosene. Let's visualize this for a second.
It's absurd.
You have starting freezing troops at 13,000 feet. A 44-gallon drum of fuel plummets down a steep incline. Even if the parachute works and even if the drum doesn't burst open on impact, how do human beings physically drag that massive drum back up a mountain?
They can't. It is penny-wise and pound-foolish on a lethal scale.
It really highlights a massive gap in joint logistics.
Exactly. The Air Force is doing its job by delivering the volume of fuel requested, but they aren't integrating with the ground reality. The lesson here is that small logistical details like the size of a container or the age of a parachute canopy dictate massive operational outcomes.
You can't just rely solely on airdrops without joint command. It leads to totally erratic support.
Especially when the weather dictates when planes can even fly.
So all of these systemic failures, the delayed production, the flawed reserve policy, the 5-kilogram Pioneer payloads, the shattered kerosene drums, They didn't just exist in a vacuum. They all violently collided at a single geographic point, the Namaka Chu.
What's fascinating here is that Nam Kachu is where the abstract formula of combat power meets brutal reality.
Right, the equation. Soldiers plus weapons plus supply plus mobility plus sustainment.
And at Nam Kachu, in October 1962, the last three variables essentially hit zero. The conditions described in the text are grim. You had troops positioned at altitudes of 15,000 feet, but because the supply chain had snapped, they were sleeping in summer uniforms,
Summer cotton uniforms in the snow.
with only a single blanket per man. Logistically, they were entirely hollowed out. They had only 3 days of food available. The soldiers were issued exactly 50 rounds of small arms ammunition per person,
Just 50 rounds. That goes in minutes in a firefight.
and their heavy fire support, like mortars, were stuck somewhere miles down the mountain because the mules and pioneers couldn't get them up the trails.
Now compare that to the opposing Chinese forces. It is a complete mismatch in preparation. The text analyzes this contrast perfectly.
The Chinese approached the requirement of sustained mountain warfare very differently. Long before the conflict escalated, they had been aggressively building road networks in Tibet.
They treated infrastructure as a weapon.
Exactly. And they used those roads to heavily stockpile supplies far forward, right near the contested areas.
So while the Indian troops are relying on patched parachutes and exhausted porters just to get dinner, the Chinese forces are already sitting on top of warehouses full of gear.
Which means the Chinese execution challenge was much simpler. They just had to maintain short supply lines from their forward depots to the front line during the fighting.
And the battlefield effect.
Overwhelming. Because their logistics were pre-positioned, they possessed the manpower, the winter gear, the food, and the resources to sustain relentless high-tempo pressure.
Preparation creates freedom of action. The side that pre-positions its logistics gets to dictate the tempo of the war.
That is the ultimate takeaway. The contrast at Nam Kachu proves our initial formula perfectly. Without sustainment and supply, the bravest soldiers are effectively disarmed by their own logistics.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do we apply this brutal lesson to modern warfare? If you wanted to create a mental one-page revision of everything we've discussed, what should it look like?
Picture a massive cause and effect table. Start with boardroom decisions, like limited industrial readiness, and draw a direct line to a frontline soldier starving at 15,000 feet. Build a mental flashcard for this concept. Logistics is the pacing item of warfare.
It sets the absolute speed limit for everything a military can achieve, and the modern lessons we pull from this.
The sources point to several. Supply chain resilience is non-negotiable. You need aggressive infrastructure development treating roads as weapons. You absolutely need joint logistics between air and ground forces. And the absolute necessity of pre-positioning gear.
Which brings up a final provocative thought for everyone listening. Today, we rely heavily on technology, right?
Right? Drones, automated supply chains, just-in-time delivery models.
Exactly. But if extreme weather environments are only getting more unpredictable and violent due to climate change, we have to ask a difficult question. Will all this automated technology actually solve the last mile problem in the mountains?
Or are we just creating a brand new, highly fragile link in the chain that a freezing storm can snap in seconds?
Exactly. If history tells us anything, it's that efficiency in peacetime often becomes a vulnerability in war. It's something to mull over on your own.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into operational logistics.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll catch you next time.